So we've come to the end of The Fall by Albert Camus. These are the final comments about it. There were some other comments in episodes 30, 38 and 42, and these are the last ones. So the hero, Jean-Baptiste Clémence, seems almost to have come full circle. At the beginning, as we noticed before, he seemed to be this kind of Luciferian figure, sarcastic, conceited, I suppose, loving to be in high places, abhorring depths. The idea of being chained up in an abyss was horrendous to him, having a disgust of anyone who judges, rejoicing in the fact that he lived for himself and regarded other people as being there simply to serve his purposes. That was what he was like to be in the first few episodes. And then he seemed to become more vulnerable and more human and fallible, and in fact exposing some of his failures and weaknesses, and inviting our pity perhaps, and perhaps self-pitying him also, telling us about some of the things that he did that he regretted deeply, which he had never been able to make restitution for, and for which he seemed almost to condemn himself. And from that he moved on to the idea of recognising that dilemma with other people. And he spoke at one stage about his attraction to and his love for the personality and the character of the man Jesus of Nazareth, his honesty and his understanding of people, but at the same time his refusal to condemn people. And we spoke in one of the episodes about the Christian understanding of how Jesus could do that, how he could refuse to condemn, because he actually bought by his own life and death the acquittal of people. And Clémence was proclaiming that and proclaiming Jesus' nature, living up to his namesake, John the Baptist. And then he went on to say how he had been pronounced Pope at one time by some of his fellow inmates of a prison camp during the Second World War, living in fairly abject circumstances. A sort of a half-crazed figure there decided that what they needed was someone to be the Pope, someone to represent all the downtrodden and unfortunate people of the world, and to bring their plight to the notice of everyone else. And Clémence was chosen to play that part, and he accepted it gladly. And from that he went on to develop his dogma of the need to forgive the Pope. And what does that really mean? So we know that he'd abhorred judges. A judge is someone that is given the responsibility in our society to find someone guilty or otherwise, sometimes by his own investigation, sometimes after a jury has made a pronouncement, but the judge has the final say of pronouncing the guilt and then determining the punishment. He's given that responsibility, he or she is given that responsibility. But if that judge, him or herself, turns out to actually be corrupt, to be guilty, to be taking bribes, or to be involved in some deviant sexual behaviour which causes him to alter his judgments, then that makes him particularly despicable, doesn't it? If he's judging other people, pronouncing the blame or otherwise pronouncing the punishments for other people, knowing that he himself is guilty, that makes him despicable. And a priest, in some traditions, is the person who receives or hears the confessions of the guilty and then gives them absolution and also pronounces the penalty, the penance that they have to act out in order to receive that absolution, has a huge responsibility. But if, again, that priest is himself guilty of crimes, particularly if he's been abusing children, but at the same time he assumes the role of offering absolution and the means to achieve absolution, does he then not become particularly despicable and to be condemned? And so the Pope, of course, is the high priest of the priests, perhaps the one who hears, in a way, the confession of the priests, who announces the judgment of the priests, is the judge of the priests, the priest of the priests. And if that one, that high priest, the Pope, is himself guilty of all sorts of terrible crimes and weaknesses which he hasn't even confessed, but which, being guilty of and continuing to act out, he still plays that role of the one who pronounces judgment on others, then he of all people is to be condemned in a way. And that would be, one would assume, the thinking of someone like Clemence. And yet Clemence says what we must do is forgive the Pope. So if the Pope, in his estimation, is someone like that, someone uniquely hypocritical, guilty, perhaps more than anyone else, and yet presuming to judge and to offer absolution to other people, then he, more than anyone, surely is to be condemned. But Clemence says we must forgive the Pope. So if he is able to do that, if knowing what weaknesses and faults are in a particular person, that such great weakness, such great faults, if he can find it in his heart to forgive that person, then it would seem that he's ready to forgive himself and to be forgiven. And in Christian deliverance ministry, where a person may be unable to overcome a thought or a habit or a belief or a behaviour that he or she hates but can't get rid of because of some demonic influence that continues to force him with a great power to act that out. And if that demonic influence may have been implanted there through the action of some abuser, someone who traumatised that person as a young person to the extent that they were unable to prevent themselves from being overtaken by that demonic influence. If then one seeks to deliver that person from the effect of that thing through deliverance, it's often taught that one of the key steps that is involved in that is the ability to forgive, even to forgive the person who committed the abuse in the first place. And it's admitted that that's not as easy as it sounds by any means, and may not be achievable, certainly not all at once, perhaps not in its totality all at once, but possibly by degrees it can be achieved to forgive that person. And I think it's recognised that even the inability to forgive does not necessarily mean that the deliverance can't occur, but at the same time the extent to which that forgiveness can be really offered and made is in a way proportional to the amount of release and freedom that that person being delivered receives. So Clemence seems to recognise that principle. He's been tormented by his failing, by his guilt, and that he can't get rid of it. He just speaks about and dwells on day and night. But if he's got to the point where he says, I can forgive the Pope, the arch-hypocrite, the one more than anyone who is guilty, if I can forgive him, I'm very close to being saved, really. I can forgive myself. I'm no longer condemned. And he seems to have reached that point. But then suddenly he seems to completely reverse course. He then says, I'm going to tell you now the doctrine of the judge penitent, and that's what I am, the judge penitent. I'm not here to confess my sins in order to encourage other people to confess theirs so that I can then forgive them. No, I'm here to confess my sins in advance so that I then am in a position to judge other people. I'm a judge penitent. I've told you the worst about me. Now I can accuse and condemn you. And that's what he says is his mission. That's his role. And then right at the end he goes back into full satanic mode again. He imagines himself reigning in some spiritual dimension, perhaps the second heaven where the demons live, receiving all the the ones who are to be judged, all the human beings that are coming before him to be accused by him and judged by him. And he says, I pity them, but I won't absolve them. I understand them, but I won't forgive them. The exact opposite of what he said that Jesus does. And then he says, and I will be adored, worshipped. So is he in fact the devil, as we thought initially? But then just after that there's a final outburst in which he really sounds like a rather pathetic aging man who's lamenting his lost youth. So is he really then just a person drawing towards the end of his life and realising the weakness and the failures of his life? Or is even Camus drawing those two ideas together and making quite a profound theological point? The devil seems so powerful to seem to be able to crush us, to condemn us, to damn us if he wants to, and we can do nothing about it almost. But at the same time, he's just a weak, pathetic individual who has no power, who's ultimately any strength that he has will be crushed down to less than the size of an atom. And that's ultimately the biblical view. So is Camus making quite a profound theological point? A theological point made by a 20th century atheist French intellectual. Can that be? It seems like it, but... And why was Camus so interested in Dostoevsky, who approached similar problems but from a position of God? So we'll talk about this more in later episodes of later on in the year when we do more about this between wars, post-war. But then the final twist of the Clément story, virtually on the last page, it seems as though perhaps he's just been talking to himself all this time. He discovers that the person that he's been holding court to in a way in this bar in Amsterdam is actually a man who's been practicing law in Paris, exactly as he has been doing. So has he all this time just been rehearsing to himself the same argument, trying to absolve himself, going over all the details of his guilt and his weakness, endlessly repeating it, always coming back to the same place again in a kind of a Sisyphus-like torment? And we know that one of the early books that Camus wrote, The Myth of Sisyphus, tells that story of the figure in Greek mythology who has to endlessly repeat this exhausting task, which he seems to complete, but then it immediately is back at the start again and he has to do it again, and endlessly going over this sense of guilt and unforgiveness and inability to escape from that. And again, it's in that book, The Myth of Sisyphus, that all these questions of Dostoevsky come up. So that's the end of the fall. And so in the next few weeks I plan to do something quite different, a few other things, and then later on we'll come back to more of this between wars post-war, and perhaps look at some more of Camus and some other things. So, right, so that's the end of that for the moment.